In this video, we're going to talk about Amazon Cognito, which is a cloud-based identity provider service that's available on AWS. I'm going to show you how to configure Cognito completely from scratch, and we're going to use it to authenticate with a .NET Core API. What's really cool about Cognito is that you can use it completely for free for up to 50,000 monthly active users. I also want to say a special thank you to AWS for sponsoring this video and helping me bring AWS closer to the .NET community. You can also grab the source code for this video completely for free from the video description. And with that out of the way, let's dive into Amazon Cognito. So what Cognito allows you to do is to easily set up user management and authentication for your mobile or web applications. The fundamental concept inside of Cognito is called a user pool, which basically represents a directory containing your application's users. Your user is going to create an account that's going to be stored inside of a user pool, and then you're going to authenticate against that user pool to get back an access token that you can use to authenticate with your application. There's also the concept of identity pools, which allow you to authorize your users and give them access to your AWS resources. Now let's head over to the AWS console, where I'm going to show you how to set up Cognito. So now I'm inside of the AWS console, and we're going to start by configuring our user pool in the Cognito service. Because I already played around with Cognito, it's available in my recently visited section, but you can just type for Cognito into the search and you can access the Cognito service from here. By default, you're going to be navigated to the user pool section, but you can also access identity pools from this screen. So let's start by creating a new user pool, and I'm going to walk you through some of the important steps that you need to consider. The first thing you need to choose is which identity providers you want to enable for your user pool. The Cognito user pool authentication provider is selected by default, but you can also configure federated identity providers, which allows you to authenticate your users using social identity providers like Facebook, Google, Amazon accounts, Apple accounts, and so on. But because I want to keep this example basic, let's just go with the default identity provider. I'm going to say that I want my users to sign in using an email, and I'll head over to the next section. Now this one allows me to configure the password policy that I want to enforce when my users are registering using Cognito, and you can see that we have some default options already prepared, such as the minimum length of the password as 8 characters and some requirements for the password strength. Of course, you can define your custom requirements if you want to, but let's use the Cognito default values. For the multi-factor authentication, I'm going to say that I don't want to use this. And then for the user account recovery, let's use the default options. And let's head over to the next screen. Here you can configure if you want to enable users to sign up on the hosted UI, which I'm going to show you a bit later. And I think it's something really cool that Cognito offers to help you move faster when it comes to signing up and authenticating users. For the account verification, I'm going to say that we're going to send the user an email to verify that they are who they say they are. And you can also configure what are some additional options that you want your users to specify when they are registering with the application. So let's pick the user's full name as an additional attribute, but you also have many other options that you can configure when you're setting up your Cognito user pool. You also have an option for specifying your custom attributes. I'm going to leave this empty, and let's head over to the next screen. Here you can configure how you are going to be emailing your users. You can use the Amazon Simple Email Service or SES for this step, but I'm going to use Cognito because I don't want to set up the Simple Email Service right now. However, note that this has a limit of sending only 50 emails a day, so you really should be using the Simple Email Service for sending your Cognito emails. This is the only thing I'm going to configure here, and let's head over to the next screen where we need to give our user pool a name. So let's call this the MJ Tech Pool. I'm going to enable the hosted UI because I'm going to use it to register my user with Cognito, and the hosted UI allows you to easily sign up and sign in using Amazon Cognito. You can also customize the design of the hosted UI, and I'm going to set up a domain where the hosted UI is going to be exposed. So let's just use MJ Tech, and then the rest of the domain is going to be the region where Cognito is configured, and it's going to be hosted on amazoncognito.com. The next step is quite important, where we need to configure our app client. An application client is used to identify the application that's trying to talk with Cognito, and you can configure a few different options. It can be a public client like a web or mobile application, or a confidential client, which is more appropriate when you want to do something on the server side. So let's pick a public client. We can give our public client a name, so let's just call it public client, and I'm going to generate a client secret that we can use together with the client ID when we are sending requests to Cognito. Now, I also want to set up a callback URL, which is where I'm going to be redirected after I have successfully authenticated with Cognito, and I'm going to say just redirect me to my website. You can also configure additional settings for your application client, such as enabling additional authentication flows. For what I'm going to show you, we can leave the default values in place. Here you can also configure the lifetimes for the ID token, access token, and the refresh token that's going to be returned for this specific application client. The default values are 60 minutes for the access token and the ID token, and then the refresh token has a value of 30 days. I'm going to leave these values in place because I think they are sensible defaults. And let's head over to the next step. Here you are given a last option to just review the settings that you configured in the previous few screens. And if you are happy with everything, you can go ahead and create your user pool, which is what I'm going to do now. And now my user pool has been successfully created. And note that we get a unique user pool ID, which is going to be important for us later when we are configuring authentication with a .NET Core application. Now let's head into the user pool that we just created. And here you can see that right now we don't have any users. But if I head over to app integration, you can see the domain for our user pool. But what I want to do is to head over to our app client that I also configured. And here I can see some details for my application client. What's going to be important is the client ID and the client secret that we're going to be using when we are calling the OAuth endpoints. But right now, I want to start from the hosted UI. You can navigate to the hosted UI from this button here, and you can see that we are greeted with a very basic sign-in screen where we can specify an email and a password. It also has the feature for recovering a password in case you forgot one, but we can also sign up to our application from this screen. If you take a look at the URL for this hosted UI, you can see some query parameters that we have here. So the client ID is the ID of our public client. The response type is set to code, which means that when we authenticate through the hosted UI, we're going to be given back a code that we can exchange for an access token. The scopes that we are requesting are also configured, as well as the redirect URI, which we configured when we were setting up Cognito. Now I'm going to go ahead and sign up to Cognito. So I'll need to specify my email and password. So I'm going to use my email. Let me specify my name, and you can see that the password strength validation is already running. So I'm going to go ahead and specify a fairly strong password and sign up. Now I'm going to be prompted to specify a verification code that was sent to me using email. I'm going to grab that code and paste it in, and I'm going to confirm my account. And what you're going to see is that I was redirected to my website, but if you take a look at the URL, we also have a code value here that we can exchange to get back an access token. So I'm going to show you how in just a moment, but while we're on my website, you may as well go ahead and sign up for the .NET Weekly newsletter, where I share a practical tip with you about .NET and software architecture every Saturday morning to more than 40,000 readers. So go ahead and subscribe to the .NET Weekly, and we are going to go back to our Cognito user interface. I want to go back to my user pool right here, and let's check out the users tab. Now that I registered my first user, it's going to be visible from my user pool. I can see what is the user's email, if the email was verified or not, and I can also go into this specific user record and view some additional information. If you require any attributes from your users, you can see that from the user attributes section here. For example, here is my user's name. Each user is also going to be assigned a unique identifier, which you can use to authenticate that user with the identity provider. This is something that's often required if you're also storing user information inside of your application's database. So you want a way to connect the user record in your database to the user record in the identity provider. And you're going to use the identity provider ID, which is this value here. Now let's head over to Postman and try to send an authorization code request to see if we can exchange the code to get back an access token. So what we're going to do here is to send an authorization code request, and we need to specify the client ID, the client secret, and the code that we get back after authenticating with Cognito. Now the endpoint that you're going to call is OAuth2 and then token, and then we need to specify some values in the request body. I'm going to send a URL encoded form, and we need to specify some key value pairs. So the first one we need to specify is the grant type. We're going to say that this is going to be authorization code. Then I'm going to specify my client ID value, which I can get from the Cognito user interface, as well as the client secret, which you can again find from the Cognito user interface. Then we need to specify the code that we got back in the redirect URL. Here's the last code that I got after logging in. We're going to exchange this code for an access token. You should also specify a redirect URI, which should be the same value that you use to obtain the initial code. So if I send this request to my Cognito instance, we're going to get back a response that's going to contain an ID token, an access token, and a refresh token. The ID token is just there to verify that this user is authenticated with our system, and we are supposed to use the access token to authenticate with our application. Let's take a look at the contents of this access token. I'm going to paste the value into the JWT IO form, and here you can see what is the payload for this access token. What we are interested in is the payload, and you can see that the subclaim here matches the identity provider ID that you could see in the Cognito user pool. The issuer is also set to our Cognito service, and this value here is our user pool identifier. This is a unique value that's assigned to our user pool, and this is what we're going to verify when we send this access token to our backend. You can also see what are the scopes that are configured for this access token, and you can also see the other values that are typical for a JSON Web Token, like for example the expiration time. The refresh token that we get back has a lifetime of 30 days, and we can use it to exchange it for a new access token. I'm going to show you what a request like that would look like. So I'm going to duplicate my authorization code request, and let's call this the refresh token flow. So the endpoint is the same, and we're also going to send the client ID and the client secret. Now I'm going to get rid of the code and the redirect URI, and let's start by updating the grant type. So it's no longer authorization code, it's now refresh token. And I also need to provide the refresh token value, which I'm going to get from my original call to the token endpoint. So now I can specify my refresh token as another argument, so I'm going to paste it here. And now if I send this request, I'm going to get back a new pair with an ID token and an access token, which are again valid for 60 minutes. So the access tokens are meant to be short-lived, and you can use them for up to an hour. And whenever the access token expires, you can use the refresh token to obtain a new access token with an updated expiration time. So let's grab this access token value, and I'm going to show you how we can use this to grab the user information from an OAuth endpoint. So I'm going to update this to a get endpoint, and let's call this the get user info. I need to update the URI from OAuth2/token to OAuth2/user info. We're not going to be sending anything in the request, but I need to specify a bearer token in my authentication header. So if I send this request, we're going to get back the user information for the user who authenticated using this access token. And this is my only user inside of the user pool. You can see I get back an email if it was verified or not, and I also get the identity provider ID that was assigned to this user. And now let me show you how we can use all of this to authenticate with a .NET Core application. So I have a simple minimal API project in .NET 8 without any authentication. If I go ahead and start my application and try to execute the weather forecast request from my HTTP file inside of Visual Studio, you will see that I get back a response. Now let's go and update our endpoint to require authorization. So I'm just going to append the call to require authorization. We also need to configure the required middleware. So let's call app use authentication, and then we're going to call app use authorization. It's important to call them in this specific order. And one more thing that I want to note is that you're going to have trouble with authentication if you're using HTTPS redirection like I'm doing here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this middleware. Setting up the middleware is just one part of the configuration. We also need to set up some services. So I'm going to say builder services, and I'm going to call add authorization, but I'm also going to chain a call to builder services add authentication. And this is where we would specify our authentication scheme, and I want to configure bearer token authentication. So I'm going to go ahead and add an additional NuGet package, and let's look for JWT bearer. And I'm going to install the latest version of Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT bearer. With this NuGet package installed, let's go back to our program file, and I'm going to specify my default scheme by accessing the JWT bearer defaults, where I have a constant with the bearer authentication scheme. I'm also going to chain a call to add JWT bearer, and now if we try to send a request to the weather forecast endpoint, we should get back a 401 response because we are not specifying a bearer token. So let's go ahead and fix this, and I'm going to introduce a class to configure my JWT bearer options. An alternative would be to specify a delegate here where you get access to the JWT bearer options, but I prefer configuring this using my application settings because this allows me to update any values at runtime by just updating the configuration values and without having to redeploy a new version of the application. Of course, if you pull the values here from configuration, it would work the same, but if you want to introduce something new, then it will require a change in the code. So I'm going to add a class called JWT bearer configure options, and I'm going to inject an iConfiguration instance, and we're going to implement the iConfigure named options interface. I'm going to say JWT bearer options, and let's go ahead and implement our interface. It has two methods, configure and configure with a name. In the second one, we're just going to call the configure method and pass in the options. I'm going to specify a constant for the configuration section in my application settings that's going to contain the value for this options object. And in the configure method, I'm going to get the values from this section and bind them to the JWT bearer options instance. I also have to configure this as a service so that it's executed when we start the application. So I'm going to say builder services configure options, and I'm going to say JWT bearer configure options. And now what I need to do is to open up my application settings and add a respective section for my JWT bearer options. Now what I want to configure is to set up the authority, which is going to match the issuer that is creating the authentication tokens. This is going to be the format for this value. So it's going to be Cognito IDP, and then the AWS region where you are hosting your Cognito service, and then you need to specify your unique user pool ID that you are using to obtain the access tokens. I'm going to use the same template for the metadata address, and I'm going to set up some options for how I want to validate my JSON Web Token. So I want to validate the issuer. I don't want to validate the audience because it's not present on the access tokens that are generated by Cognito, and I want to validate the issuer signing key. If I grab a new access token and I open it up in JWT.io, you can see that here is my issuer matching the pattern that I just showed you. So you can see the US East 1 region here, and then the user pool ID, which matches the identifier of my user pool. I also mentioned that the audience isn't present on this access token, and instead you can see that we have the client ID, which matches the identifier of the app client that we use to obtain this access token. So I'm going to use this issuer value here, and I'm going to specify it inside of my application settings. In general, you don't want to be hard coding stuff like this inside your application settings. It would be more appropriate to provide these values through my user secrets, and you can do this by saying manage user secrets, and then you can paste in the values from here. And this is how you could avoid specifying sensitive values inside of your source control. So you can keep the actual values inside of your user secrets, and in the application settings, you are just going to specify a placeholder that can safely be committed into source control. So with this setup in place, let's try to send our request again. But I'm also going to be passing in an access token. So I'm going to add a variable that's going to contain my access token value, which I'm going to paste in, and then I can provide my access token as an additional request header. So if I go and send this request, I'm going to get back a 401 unauthorized because I probably messed something up, like the metadata address here. So let me go ahead and update this, and I'm going to restart the API. So this time, if I send the request with the access token present, I should get back a proper response, which is the case. So you can see that we are authenticating with our API using the access token that we obtained from Cognito, and we get back the response from the weather service. I also want to add one more endpoint here. It's going to be on the /claims route. We're going to inject a claims principal, which allows us to access the claims for the authenticated user, and we're going to just project the claim type and the claim value and return that inside of an array. Let me go back to my HTTP file, where I'm going to specify this request. And if I send this request to the API with the access token present, we are going to get back a list of claims that are present on the access token. So you can see we have the name identifier claim, which matches the user identifier in Cognito. We also have the issuer, the client ID that was used to generate this token, the scopes that were assigned to this access token, and also when it expires. So this is how you can use Amazon Cognito as an identity provider for your application, and how to implement JSON Web Token authentication inside of your .NET Core application. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about JSON Web Token authentication in .NET, then you should watch this video next. Make sure to smash the like and subscribe buttons under the video, and until next time, stay awesome.